No one knew what kind of king Henry would be. He'd spent most of his youth preferring the company of knaves and drunkards, getting into fights and gambling. But that all changed the day he was crowned King Henry V of England. England and France had been at war for 25 years, and although an uneasy truce existed between them, the court was nervous. Some thought Henry would be a rebellious king. Others thought it would be a complete disaster. Some said only time would tell. But all agreed Henry did not have an easy task ahead of him. One morning, not long after Henry's coronation, he was gathered with his high council in the reception chamber of his palace in London. Among them was the Duke of Exeter, King Henry's uncle, and he asked the king a question. "You have your mother's dark eyes," he said, "but I wonder, do you have your father's courage?" Many of his advisers had told Henry that he had claim to lands in France, however distant or ancient in the family they might be. They were real. The people of England were divided and bitter after years of civil wars. Henry knew that one cause could unite them. At that very moment, the door to the chamber swung open, and in walked the ambassador to the Dauphin, the crown prince of France. He was a very dandy sort of fellow with a curled beard, and the clothes he wore were as brightly coloured as peacock's feathers. He brought a message from the Dauphin. He carried a large wooden chest, which he placed in the middle of the chamber in front of King Henry. As the ambassador entered the chamber, he gave an elaborate bow. "Your Highness," he said, in a voice as smooth as honey, "my master the Dauphin, he sends greetings." Henry looked unamused. "I want more than greetings," he said. "I asked King Charles for the land in France that I have right to. What is his answer?" The ambassador ran his fingers through the long curls in his beard. "The king is busy with important matters, and His Majesty thought that since the Dauphin is closer to Your Majesty in age, that he would be better placed to deal with this issue." Henry felt a sting of anger at the ambassador's insolent tone, but he kept his voice calm. "And what is the Dauphin's message?" he asked. The Dauphin thinks you are too young to concern yourself with the matters of state, so he has sent a gift which he thinks is more appropriate for you than French dukedoms. The ambassador clicked his fingers, and at that moment a guard opened the lid of the chest that had been placed in the middle of the floor. It was full of hundreds of tennis balls, and one of them rolled to the foot of Henry's throne. The nobles glanced at each other nervously. King Henry had been insulted and humiliated in front of the courtiers. Henry simply leaned over and picked up the ball. "We are pleased that the Dauphin is so pleasant with us. Tell the Dauphin that he has begun a game with me that he will wish he had never started. His mockery will turn these tennis balls into cannonballs. The people of France may be laughing at the Dauphin's joke, but they'll weep before I am finished. The king had declared war on France. Men from all over the counties answered the king's call. Blacksmiths, wheelwrights, weavers, clerks, all left their homes and marched on the road that led to Southampton. The younger men thought that it would be a kind of holiday and were eager for glory and fame. But those who had fought before and knew what war was like were grim-faced and silent. At Southampton, the men began their training. Hour after hour, day after day, they marched and drilled. At the archery butts, men with longbows practiced until their aim was true. Slowly, the raggle-taggle band of volunteers was transformed into an army. It took all day for Henry and his men to cross the channel and unload the ships. That night they slept on the beach, but they were woken early in the grey hours before dawn to sharpen their weapons and make ready for battle. On the skyline, the city of Harfleur looked like an ominous cloud. When the sun rose that morning, Henry rode out in front of his men on his dapple-grey warhorse, the early morning light glinting on his armour. "The English are a peaceful nation," he told the troops. "But when war comes, we can fight like tigers. Let the light of battle blaze in your eyes to burn the courage of your enemies. Let your cry be God for Harry, England, and St. George!" Cannons roared like gigantic waves breaking on the shore as the English army charged. By nightfall, Harfleur had fallen. Henry and his men had achieved a great victory at Harfleur, showing him as a king that was not to be underestimated, and that his army was a force to be reckoned with. As he was planning to advance on the port of Calais, a messenger arrived from King Charles of France. "The king commands that you leave France while you still can," the messenger said scornfully. "He is camped at Agincourt with an army of 50,000. Henry's men looked worried at this. The Duke of Exeter, Henry's uncle, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we only have 4,000 men. If the French attack us here, all will be lost." "Then we must go to them, uncle," said Henry calmly. He turned to the messenger from the king and said, "Tell Charles that his army is in my way. I will march on Agincourt, and if they do not leave, the ground will be stained red with French blood." And so the English marched on Agincourt and set up camp, facing the French, on a plain field between two woodlands. When the French army saw the size of the English army, they jeered and whistled, beating their swords against their shields to make a great clamour. But Henry tried to shut his ears to their taunts and focused on positioning his armies and making a battle plan. He talked with his commanders late into the night, and when they left, he tried to rest, but his head was a whirlpool of thoughts. He could not sleep, and so, hoping to calm himself, he put on a long cloak and a hood, and walked among the camp with the soldiers. Some were there, gathered around fires, huddled to keep warm, talking and laughing, anything to pass the time. Others cried out in fear through nightmares. Henry looked across the field, and in the distance saw the campfires of the French army glittering in the darkness. They were as numberless as the stars on a winter's night. In the early hours, a thunderstorm broke, and rain fell, turning the plain into a sea of mud. But it stopped just before dawn, as the sun rose on the battlefield. The first line of the French army took to the field, led by knights on horseback. The plumes of their helmets fluttered brightly against the dark sky, and their armour shone like silver. Behind them ran infantrymen in chainmail coats carrying blue shields painted with golden fleur-de-lis. Henry ordered his archers to stand ready and wait for his signal. The French knights broke into a gallop. The hooves of the horses shook the ground and spattered their riders with mud. The knights lowered their lances and screamed out a battle cry. But halfway to the English line, the French horses ran into boggy ground and the charge faltered. The knights pulled their reins in panic, turning their horses to try and find firmer footing. The infantrymen caught up, and all was a surging chaos of whinnying horses and cursing men. A second line of French troops charged. Once more the English archers stopped them. The French tried to retreat, but ran into their own third line as it came up behind them. It was then that Henry led his men in a charge. The two armies met with a clash, like a clap of thunder. The fighting lasted for 2 hours. The French soldiers were dismayed and confused, and crawled back to find their commanders dead. There was no one to give them orders, and the fury of the English attack was too much for them, and they fled. 7,000 Frenchmen died at Agincourt. The English lost only 100 men. That night, at sunset, a French messenger rode into the English camp. It was the same messenger that had come to Henry at Harfleur, but this time he was not so proud. His armour was dinted and dirty, and his face was red with blood. King Charles begs for peace. He will return all of the lands that you claim, and he offers the hand of his daughter, Princess Catherine, as a peace offering. Henry replied, but he looked solemn and not proud. I accept, he replied. We will meet and draw up a peace treaty. Henry and the French king brokered a peace that lasted for many years. Henry wooed Catherine and managed to win her heart, marrying her and bringing her back to England as his queen. But most importantly, Henry had won the love and trust of his people. And that was the kind of king that he had always wanted to be.